There's a hidden battlefield in history where the weapons weren't swords or cannons, they were words. Picture this: a crowded theater, the hush of anticipation, and then a line delivered that sends a shockwave through the room. In that moment, a playwright could do what armies failed to achieve: strike fear into the hearts of kings. This is the story of 29 banned stage plays that didn't just entertain audiences, they threatened to topple thrones. From the glittering courts of Europe to the rowdy playhouses of London, these scripts were deemed so dangerous, they were censored, burned, or locked away. But why? What could a piece of paper contain that made rulers tremble more than an invading army? The answer lies in the power of ideas that exposed hypocrisy, mocked tyranny, or whispered revolution to anyone who listened. Think about the last time a story moved you. Maybe it made you laugh, cry, or question everything you thought you knew. Now imagine that story had the power to unravel an entire government. That's the untold danger of these banned plays. They weren't just forbidden for being scandalous or crude. They were silenced because they struck at the very foundations of power. Take Elizabethan England, where Queen Elizabeth's censors scrutinized every line, terrified that a clever metaphor could spark rebellion. Or Louis XIV's France, where playwrights who mocked the aristocracy suddenly found themselves exiled. These weren't just stories, they were acts of defiance dressed in verse and dialogue. And the punishments for staging them, harsh enough to make you wonder, what was so threatening about a group of actors pretending to be kings and queens? What if I told you that some of history's most explosive revolutions began not with a battle cry, but with a soliloquy? That's the mystery we're unraveling today. Behind every banned play, there's a shadow, a ruler who feared the pen more than the sword, a writer who risked everything to speak truth, and an audience that might just rise up if they heard it. Over the centuries, governments have tried to erase these plays from memory, but their echoes remain. So join me as we step into the archives and onto the stages where these forbidden works once thrived. We'll uncover the secrets they tried to silence, meet the playwrights who dared to defy kings, and discover why sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't a blade, it's a spotlight. There's something uniquely dangerous about laughter. It slips past defenses, disarms authority, and lingers long after the curtain falls. That's why satire became the playwright's sharpest weapon. Unlike outright rebellion, which could be crushed with force, satire worked in whispers and winks, hiding its blows behind exaggerated characters and absurd plots. Molière's Tartuffe didn't just mock one hypocritical priest, it exposed an entire system where piety was a performance, and the French clergy saw themselves in that unflattering mirror. The backlash was swift, but here's the twist: banning it only fueled its fame. Copies circulated underground, and every attempt to suppress it made the play's critique even louder. Then there's Ben Jonson's Sejanus, a story so thinly veiled that King James's court recognized their own greed and paranoia in every line. Jonson didn't just write a tragedy about ancient Rome. He held up a distorted reflection of his own era, where power corrupted absolutely. The king's response, arresting Jonson for treasonous content. But the real crime wasn't the play's plot. It was its audacity to remind audiences that their rulers were just as flawed as the villains onstage. And that's the genius of satire. It doesn't demand revolt, it simply asks, "Do you see what I see?" Once that question is planted, it grows. The stage's power lay in its immediacy. Unlike pamphlets or speeches, a play unfolded in real time, with living, breathing actors making the absurdity of power feel visceral. When an audience laughed at a buffoonish king, they weren't just entertained, they were complicit. That collective moment of recognition terrified monarchs, because while you can execute a rebel, how do you silence a joke that's already been heard? The answer for many rulers was to ban the play, exile the playwright, or shutter theaters entirely. But history shows us the irony. The harder they tried to erase these works, the more indelible they became. The stage, it turns out, was the one battlefield where power couldn't dictate the ending. Imagine writing a play so dangerous that not only was it banned, but every known copy was destroyed, erased from history as if it never existed. That's the fate of the Isle of Dogs, a lost masterpiece of rebellion that vanished into the shadows of Elizabethan England. In 1597, Ben Jonson and Thomas Nashe dared to push satire to its limits, crafting a story so biting that authorities panicked. The title alone a crude jab at Queen Elizabeth's inner circle, likening them to snarling, untamed beasts, hinted at its explosive content. But what exactly did it say? We'll never know. The play was scrubbed from record so thoroughly that today it exists only in rumors and court documents. What makes this censorship so chilling isn't just the loss of art, it's the precision of the crackdown. Jonson was thrown into prison, theaters across London were forcibly closed, and the message was clear: cross the line and your work disappears. This wasn't about protecting morals or even the Queen's reputation. It was about dismantling a threat that no sword could defeat. Unlike pamphlets which required literacy, plays reached everyone: the butcher, the baker, the illiterate servant laughing in the back row. The stage gave dissent a voice, and that voice could spread like wildfire. The real tragedy of the Isle of Dogs isn't just its absence, it's what its destruction reveals about power. When rulers can't refute an idea, they erase it. But here's the twist: censorship often backfires. By making the play forbidden, the crown turned it into legend. Taverns buzzed with theories about its contents, and underground copies may have circulated secretly, each whispered retelling amplifying its subversion. In the end, the attempt to silence dissent only proved how unstoppable it truly was. The play may be gone, but its ghost lingers, a reminder that no amount of ink or authority can fully extinguish a dangerous idea. And so the Isle of Dogs became the blueprint for every banned play that followed. Its fate taught playwrights a grim lesson: satire could cost you your freedom or worse. But it also taught audiences something even more powerful: that when a story frightens those in charge, it's usually because it's true. Even William Shakespeare, the crown jewel of English literature, found himself tangled in the dangerous web of political censorship. His history play, Richard II, was never officially banned, but in 1601 it became a weapon. The Earl of Essex, a fallen favorite of Queen Elizabeth, saw in Shakespeare's drama something explosive: the story of a weak king overthrown by his own nobles. On the eve of his rebellion, Essex's supporters paid the Lord Chamberlain's men to stage a special performance, turning the playhouse into a rallying cry. The message was unmistakable: if Richard could be toppled, so too could Elizabeth. The Queen's reaction was legendary. When she learned of the performance, she reportedly stormed, "I am Richard II, know ye not that?" Her fury wasn't just about treason, it was about recognition. Shakespeare had held up a mirror, and Elizabeth saw her own vulnerabilities reflected back. The play's themes of poor leadership and popular unrest were already sensitive, but in that moment, art stopped being entertainment and became a call to action. The rebellion failed, but the damage was done. Overnight, Richard II transformed from a historical drama into a cautionary tale about the power of theatre. Here's the fascinating twist: the play itself survived untouched. No pages were burned, no performances outright forbidden. Instead, the government targeted context. Staging it became a political act, and playwrights learned to read the room. This wasn't just censorship, it was psychological warfare. The Crown couldn't erase Shakespeare's words, so they weaponized timing and intention. Suddenly, every line about kingship carried double meaning, and theatre companies had to ask themselves, is this art or is this a noose? Shakespeare, ever the survivor, adapted. Later plays like Henry V glorified strong leadership, while Macbeth framed regicide as a cosmic crime, but the ghost of Richard II lingered. It proved that history isn't just about the past, it's a tool, malleable in the hands of those who know how to wield it, and perhaps that's why this episode still chills us today. Because when a government fears a play more than an army, it's not just the throne that's at stake, it's the very idea of who gets to control the story. There's a special kind of audacity in writing a play so clever, it insults a king to his face while giving him just enough cover to pretend he didn't notice. That's the razor's edge the Maid's tragedy walked in 1619. On the surface, it was a gripping tale of ancient royalty. A king commands a soldier to marry his mistress, then cruelly reclaims her, unraveling lives in the process. But London's theatregoers weren't fooled. The whispers started opening night. This wasn't just fiction. It was a barely veiled retelling of the Earl of Somerset's disgrace, a man who'd risen to power as King James's favorite, only to fall spectacularly after a messy divorce and murder scandal. Beaumont and Fletcher's genius was in the layers. Set the story in a vague, ancient court, sprinkle in enough mythological flourishes to satisfy the censors, but lace every line with double meanings. When the king in the play demands, "She is my mistress and I'll have her obeyed," the audience didn't hear a fictional tyrant. They heard James's own voice, echoing his infamous indulgence of favorites. The playwrights never named names, never pointed fingers. They didn't have to. The crowd connected the dots themselves, turning every performance into a collective act of recognition. And that's what made it dangerous. Authorities could ban outright criticism, but how do you prosecute a metaphor? The play survived exactly 3 performances before vanishing from the stage. Yet its legacy outlasted the crackdown. The Maid's tragedy became a masterclass in how to weaponize ambiguity. Playwrights took notes, swapped crowns for togas, turned courtiers into shepherds, and let the audience's imagination do the rest. Censors were left chasing shadows, forced to ask, was that line about a Greek god's jealousy or a jab at the Queen's latest feud? This dance between creators and kings reshaped theatre itself. Allegory became an art form, with playwrights coding contemporary scandals into timeless tales. The irony, the more rulers tightened their grip, the more ingenious the disguises became. A band play might disappear from the stage, but its ideas whispered in taverns, scribbled in margins, could never truly be erased, and that's the real lesson of the Maid's tragedy. It proved that sometimes the most subversive thing you can do is tell the truth while giving power just enough deniability to look the other way. There's a moment in the Spanish tragedy where a man, wronged beyond bearing, chooses silence not out of resignation, but as the ultimate act of defiance. He bites off his own tongue rather than speak within a system that's rigged against him. When Thomas Kyd wrote that scene in the 1590s, he wasn't just crafting shock value for the groundlings. He was holding up a grotesque mirror to an England where justice often went to the highest bidder. The censor's reaction cut the tongue scene immediately. Not because it was too violent, but because they understood its real horror. A man so broken by corruption, even his screams were futile. Kyd's genius was in disguising political critique as pulp fiction. On the surface, the Spanish tragedy is pure spectacle, ghosts demanding vengeance, poisonings, secret letters, and a climactic play within, a play that ends in bloodshed. But beneath the melodrama, it asked a question that terrified the crown. What happens when people stop believing in laws? The answer plays out in every act as characters take justice into their own hands, each murder justified by the failures of those in power. London's audiences didn't just watch this cycle of violence, they cheered it. And that's when the authorities realized the true danger. Here's why this play struck deeper than any polemic. Revenge tragedies worked like Trojan horses. They let audiences experience catharsis without overt rebellion. When Hieronymo, the grieving father turned avenger, finally gets his bloody satisfaction, the message wasn't, obey the system, it was, the system has already failed you. That's why the Crown didn't just censor the tongue scene. They watched the crowd's reaction to Hieronymo's final monologue, where he declares, "Justice is exiled from the earth." Those words didn't just describe a fictional Spain, they named the quiet fury simmering in Elizabethan England. Yet banning the play outright would have been an admission, proof that the government feared its own people. So instead, they tried to neuter it, trimming the most incendiary moments while letting the plot stand. It didn't work. Like a hydra, every cut seemed to spawn new interpretations. Underground copies circulated with the forbidden scenes restored, and actors ad-libbed lines that made the subtext even clearer. The Spanish tragedy became a blueprint for how art could smuggle dissent into the mainstream, wrapped in the respectable cloak of entertainment. What makes kids' play so enduring isn't just its critique of corruption, it's how it exposes the hypocrisy of censorship itself. By trying to control the narrative, the Crown accidentally proved the play's central thesis, that power, when unchecked, will always try to silence the voices that challenge it. And in doing so, they turned a bloody revenge drama into something far more dangerous, a mirror no government could afford to look into for too long. Imagine a play so bold it turned international diplomacy into a board game where kings and queens weren't just characters, but literal chess pieces moving across a stage. That's exactly what Thomas Middleton pulled off with A Game at Chess in 1624. At a time when England and Spain were locked in a tense dance of failed alliances and mutual distrust, Middleton didn't just whisper criticism. He staged it as a full-blown spectacle. The chessboard became his battlefield, with Spain's black pieces scheming and England's white pieces stumbling into traps. And the masterstroke, the audience didn't need a single line of dialogue to get the joke. The moment the Spanish Black Knight slinked onto stage, his exaggerated villainy drew roars of laughter. This wasn't subtle allegory, it was political satire with the volume cranked to 10. What made A Game at Chess explosive wasn't just its audacity, but its timing. King James I had spent years pushing for a marriage alliance between his son and Spain's Infanta, a deal that collapsed spectacularly, leaving England humiliated. Middleton's play turned that humiliation into public catharsis. Night after night, Londoners packed the globe to watch the Spanish pieces get outmaneuvered, cheering as their own bumbling white king fumbled toward redemption. For 9 straight performances, the play wasn't just entertainment, it was communal vindication. And that's when Spain's ambassador erupted. The diplomatic outcry was immediate. Either England censored the play or risked shattering an already fragile peace. Here's where censorship gets messy. The Crown didn't ban A Game at Chess because they disagreed with its message. They banned it because the message worked too well. Unlike dense political treatises, Middleton's chess metaphor transcended class and literacy. Groundlings who couldn't read a pamphlet grasped the symbolism instantly, and that universality terrified the establishment. Worse yet, the play's runaway success exposed an uncomfortable truth. Theaters weren't just royal playthings, they were businesses and scandals sold. The Globe's owners knew they had a hit on their hands, but when the king's men came knocking, profit bowed to politics. Overnight, the play vanished from the stage, not because its ideas were silenced, but because its popularity made them too dangerous to ignore. Yet the real legacy of a game at chess lies in what it revealed about power dynamics. Censorship wasn't just about controlling art, it was about managing optics. By sacrificing the play, James saved face with Spain, but at the cost of fueling public disillusionment. Theaters learned to self-censor, yes, but audiences learned something darker, that their laughter carried weight. And perhaps that's the most subversive lesson of all. When a government fears applause more than protest, it's not just a play they're banning, it's the people's right to see their own frustrations reflected back at them. Middleton's chessboard proved that sometimes the most dangerous move isn't checkmate. It's letting the crowd decide who's really winning. The Libertine didn't just shock audiences, it dismantled the very idea of moral authority. Thomas Shadwell's take on Don Juan in 1675 wasn't the familiar sinner begging for hellfire. This libertine laughed in the face of damnation, seducing and swaggering his way through a world where the rules didn't apply to men like him. And that was the problem. In Restoration England, where King Charles II's court partied openly while preaching piety to the masses, Shadwell's play ripped off the hypocrisy with glee. When Don Juan declared, "I'll not be confined by the dull morals of the herd," it wasn't just a character's boast, it was an echo of the aristocracy's unspoken creed. Censors didn't ban the play because it glorified sin. They banned it because it exposed the double standard at the heart of power. If a nobleman's vices were celebrated on stage, why should a baker or blacksmith believe in divine right? The stage had always been a space where social norms could be stretched, but the Libertine didn't stretch them, it snapped them. By letting Don Juan win, Shadwell implied a terrifying idea. Maybe the so-called moral order was just a tool to keep the poor in line while the rich did as they pleased. What made this play uniquely dangerous was its audience. Restoration theatergoers weren't just nobles in powdered wigs. They were apprentices, shopkeepers, and servants, people who knew firsthand how differently justice applied depending on your birth. When they watched Don Juan outwit priests and cuckold husbands without consequence, the laughter in the pit carried an edge. It wasn't just amusement, it was recognition. And that's why the Crown intervened. A play that made sin look fun was one thing. A play that made inequality look arbitrary was revolutionary. The crackdown on the Libertine revealed the real stakes of censorship. It wasn't about protecting souls, it was about protecting systems. By silencing Don Juan's triumph, authorities sent a message. Morality wasn't divine, it was political. The stage could mock kings, yes, but it couldn't let the audience question why kings existed at all. Yet, like so many banned works, Shadwell's play refused to stay buried. Pirated copies circulated in coffeehouses, and its central irony lived on. The very act of suppression proved the playwright's point. If virtue was truly universal, why did the powerful fear a comedy? The answer, whispered in taverns and scribbled in margins, was simpler than any sermon. Because when people stop believing in the rules, they start asking who made them. And that's a question no throne can survive. What if the most dangerous criminal wasn't a lone thief, but an entire system? That's the question John Gay forced London to confront with the Beggar's opera in 1728. On the surface, it was a raucous musical romp, highwaymen swapping witty banter, women outsmarting their would-be captors, and a jailbreak set to jaunty tunes. But beneath the merry melodies lurked a venomous truth. The so-called criminals on stage were no worse than the politicians in Parliament. When the dashing outlaw Mashith sings, The modes of the court so common are grown that a true friend can hardly be met. Every note dripped with irony. The audience roared not just at the jokes, but at the uncomfortable realization that the real thieves wore powdered wigs, not masks. Gay's genius was in his framing. By setting his story among thieves and sex workers, he turned morality upside down. These weren't villains, they were survivors in a world where everyone, judges, merchants, even the king's ministers, played the same game of greed. The only difference, the upper classes had laws to legitimize their theft. When the character Peachum, a fence who profits off stolen goods, declares, "In one respect indeed, we may be reckoned dishonest. We cheat the public," the line landed like a grenade. Because everyone knew Peachum's day job mirrored real-life corruption scandals rocking Robert Walpole's government. The play didn't just accuse the powerful of wrongdoing, it showed how crime and governance were two sides of the same coin. Then came the backlash, when Gay wrote a sequel, Folly, shifting the action to the colonial Caribbean and portraying enslaved people overthrowing their masters. Censors didn't just ban it, they personally intervened to block its publication. Walpole, who'd endured years of thinly veiled mockery in Gay's work, saw the danger immediately. A play that equated colonialism with piracy wasn't just satire, it was a blueprint for rebellion. But here's what the government underestimated: you can't arrest a melody. The songs from the Beggar's opera spilled out of theaters and into taverns, street corners, and even nursery rhymes. Catchy tunes like "Over the Hills and Far Away" became protest anthems, turning every hummed chorus into an act of quiet defiance. This was censorship's new nightmare. Pamphlets could be seized, playwrights jailed, but how do you confiscate a tune stuck in someone's head? Gay had unlocked something revolutionary: art's ability to replicate like a virus. And that's why the Beggar's opera still resonates today. It proved that when oppression wears a suit, sometimes the most effective resistance comes dressed as entertainment. Because laughter once heard can't be unheard, and a song once sung belongs to everyone. There's something unnerving about a story that predicts its own tragedy, especially when that story ends with a king's murder. Eugene Scribe's opera Gustav Roman III wasn't just a dramatic retelling of Swedish history. It became a grim prophecy. In 1792, as the real King Gustav attended a performance of the very opera that depicted his ancestor's assassination, an assassin lurked in the shadows. The killer didn't just take inspiration from the plot, he used the spectacle as his alibi, blending into the chaos of the performance to strike. The irony was too sharp to ignore. Art hadn't merely foreshadowed violence, it had, in a way, orchestrated it. The fallout was immediate and far-reaching. Governments across Europe, already nervous in the wake of the French Revolution, saw Scribe's opera as proof that theater could be a weapon. Censors didn't just ban the play, they launched a crusade against any depiction of regicide, no matter how ancient or fictional. Shakespeare's Macbeth, a century-old classic, suddenly vanished from stages, deemed too dangerous for audiences who might see in it a blueprint rather than a cautionary tale. The debate wasn't just about censorship, it was about fear. Could a play plant ideas, or did it simply hold up a mirror to the discontent already simmering beneath the surface? Here's where the paradox deepens. By banning these works, authorities didn't erase their power, they amplified it. A forbidden play became a whispered obsession, its themes dissected in private salons and back-alley print shops. The very act of suppression turned artistic metaphor into political fact, and in that tension, something new was born: the modern content warning. Governments, realizing they couldn't eliminate dangerous ideas outright, began labeling them instead, hoping to control how audiences interpreted what they saw. It was a clumsy compromise, an attempt to have it both ways, to allow the art but neuter its impact. Yet the legacy of Gustav III lingers in every debate about art's responsibility. When does storytelling cross the line from reflection to incitement? The opera's true crime wasn't depicting a murder, it was exposing the fragility of power. Because once people see tyranny as a script, something to be performed and then rewritten, the stage stops being just entertainment. It becomes a rehearsal. And that's the realization that still sends shivers down the spines of those in charge. After all, the most terrifying thing about a play isn't the bloodshed on stage. It's the thought that someone in the audience might be taking notes. Picture an asylum where the inmates don't just rave, they reenact history with chilling precision. That's the disorienting genius of Peter Weiss's Marat/Sade, a play so volatile it made 20th century dictators tremble just as Renaissance kings once had. Set in a mental hospital where patients perform the murder of French revolutionary Jean-Paul Marat, the script blurs every line between actor and audience, sanity and chaos, past and present. When the chorus chants, "We want our revolution now," it's not a historical reenactment anymore. It's a provocation, and that's exactly why apartheid South Africa and Franco's Spain banned it on sight. They recognized the danger. This wasn't just a play about revolution. It was a rehearsal. What made Marat/Sade uniquely threatening was its refusal to let audiences off the hook. Brechtian techniques shattered the illusion of passive spectatorship. Actors lunged into the crowd, monologues veered into direct accusations, and the asylum's inmates played by the actors would suddenly break character to debate whether violence ever truly changes anything. In one notorious scene, a patient playing Robespierre turns to the crowd and sneers. You sit there watching, just like the bourgeoisie watched heads roll. The fourth wall didn't just break, it collapsed entirely, forcing viewers to confront their own complicity. For authoritarian regimes, this was the ultimate heresy, art that trained people to interrogate reality itself. The bans poured in, but the reasons varied tellingly. South Africa's apartheid government condemned it as communist propaganda, while Franco's Spain called it degenerate. Both missed the point. Marat/Sade wasn't advocating for revolution, it was exposing the cyclical madness of power. When the inmate playing Marat screams, "The revolution is like a mirror, it shows you who you really are," the line cut both ways. Tyrants saw their own reflections in the chaos, and they couldn't look away. That's the play's enduring power. It didn't just depict violence, it demonstrated how easily theater could become a contagion, spreading doubt instead of dogma. Yet here's the twist censors never grasped. Suppressing Marat/Sade only proved its central thesis. By treating the play as dangerous, authorities mirrored the very paranoia it satirized, the fear that ideas once unleashed can't be controlled. And in doing so, they turned Weiss's meta-drama into something even more potent, a living testament to art's ability to outlast the systems that try to silence it. The stage, after all, has always been society's asylum, a place where the mad ideas of one era become the truths of the next. In 2013, a theater in Hong Kong planned something radical, a play not about ancient kings or fictional rebels, but about a living, breathing thorn in the Chinese government side, Ai Weiwei. The dissident artist, known for his provocative installations and unflinching critiques of censorship, had already been jailed once. Now his story was heading to the stage. But before rehearsals could begin, the pressure came down like a hammer. Phone calls from unnamed officials, sudden safety inspections at the theater, and veiled threats about funding cuts. The message was clear: this play would never open. What the censors didn't anticipate was how badly their old tactics would backfire in the digital age. Here's where the script took on a life of its own. Leaked PDFs of the play began circulating on encrypted messaging apps. while snippets were read aloud in underground art spaces from Berlin to Buenos Aires. A banned play about censorship became, ironically, a global conversation about censorship. Hashtags like #the arrest of AI Weiwei trended briefly before being scrubbed from Chinese platforms, only to resurface on international servers. The government's attempt to erase the story became the story itself, a modern twist on an ancient pattern. Because while emperors once burned scrolls, today's rulers battle something far more elusive, the infinite replaceability of ideas. What makes this case so revealing is its duality. On one hand, it proves how little censorship's core tactics have changed. Intimidation, bureaucracy, and the quiet leverage of power still work. But the backlash also exposes a new vulnerability. When a play exists as code, easily copied, shared, or even performed guerrilla style in living rooms, the very act of banning it becomes a performance. AI Weiwei himself grasped this, tweeting before his account was suspended. They fear the play because they know it won't stay on stage, and he was right. The script's forbidden status turned it into a metonym for China's broader crackdown on dissent, with each shared file acting as a tiny act of defiance. The most haunting question isn't whether the play was silenced, but whether such silencing is even possible anymore. In the 15th century, burning every copy of The Isle of Dogs might have worked. But in an era where art lives in clouds and thumb drives, suppression often functions like a spotlight. Every deleted post, every shuttered production, leaves a digital footprint that curious audiences can trace. This isn't to say censorship is powerless, far from it, but it's fighting a war where every retreat is archived, every overreach immortalized in screenshots. The stage may have been dark that night in Hong Kong, but the story was just beginning to spread, and perhaps that's the real lesson here. When you try to erase a mirror, you only prove how badly someone needed to look into it. There's a special kind of audacity in turning a king into a literal toilet joke, and then watching half the audience storm out in fury. That's exactly what Alfred Jarry achieved with Ubu Roi in 1896, a play so deliberately crude it made the word murder a nonsense variant of murd or shit its opening line. From the moment Ubu, the bloated, cowardly monarch, waddled onto stage, the Parisian elite knew they weren't watching satire. This was a full-blown desecration. Jarry hadn't just written a farce about tyranny, he'd stripped power of all its grandeur, reducing it to fart jokes and petty greed, and that's why the riots started before the first act ended. What made Ubu Roi so explosive wasn't just its vulgarity, it was the target. France, still nursing the wounds of revolution and counter-revolution, had spent decades carefully mythologizing authority. Even Republicans treated the idea of governance with solemnity. Then along came Jarry, dragging kingship through the mud like a schoolboy doodling mustaches on state portraits. Ubu wasn't a villain, he was a buffoon screaming shitstorm as he tripped over his own crown. The critics weren't wrong to call it anarchic. The play didn't just critique power, it dissolved it in acid laughter. And that's the line no establishment can afford to cross. You can survive being hated, but never ridiculous. The play's legacy, though, outlasted the scandal. Modern satire owes Ubu Roi a debt most viewers don't even realize. When South Park depicts politicians as screeching man children or spitting image, turns world leaders into grotesque puppets, they're channeling Jarry's central insight. Nothing defangs tyranny faster than mockery. Because while a revolutionary pamphlet might inspire anger, a well-timed fart joke inspires something far more dangerous, contempt. And contempt, once seeded, is impossible to uproot. Yet here's the twist censors missed. By trying to suppress Ubu Roi, they turned Jarry's juvenile humor into high art. The very crudeness that horrified critics became a badge of honor. proving that sometimes the most radical act isn't a raised fist but a snorted laugh. Because when people stop fearing power, they start laughing at it, and that's when the real revolution begins. History is written by the victors until a playwright picks up the pen. That's the seismic shift Rolf Hochhuth triggered in 1963 with The Deputy, a play so incendiary it didn't just ruffle feathers, it set fire to the Vatican's carefully curated narrative. At its heart was a question that still haunts us: what does silence cost? Hochhuth's documentary-style drama accused Pope Pius XII of turning a blind eye to the Holocaust, dramatizing moments where the Church's inaction became its own form of complicity. The production didn't just name names, it staged them with actors playing cardinals and Nazi officers in chillingly polite negotiations. Overnight, theaters became battlegrounds. Catholic groups picketed performances, Switzerland banned it outright, and in Rome, whispers of excommunication swirled around anyone involved. But here's what the outrage missed: the play wasn't an attack on faith. It was a reckoning with institutional failure. What made The Deputy uniquely dangerous wasn't its criticism, it was its method. Hochhuth didn't rely on rumor or hyperbole. He built his case from declassified documents, eyewitness accounts, and the Vatican's own archives, turning dry paperwork into visceral drama. When a character based on Kurt Gerstein, a conflicted SS officer, pleads with church officials to intervene, only to be met with bureaucratic shrugs, audiences didn't just hear history, they felt its weight. That emotional alchemy was the play's real transgression. By humanizing the paper trail, Hochhuth forced a confrontation with something more unsettling than villainy: the banality of moral evasion. The Vatican's response became its own tragicomic subplot. Instead of engaging with the accusations, church officials denounced the play as communist propaganda and pressured governments to censor it. In Austria, lawmakers debated a special bill to block performances, while in Spain, Franco's regime preemptively banned it without even waiting for protests. But every attempt to silence The Deputy backfired spectacularly. Newspapers reprinted excerpts in defiance, academic symposia dissected its claims, and underground readings sprang up in basements and bookshops. The harder authorities pushed, the more the play morphed from a theatrical event into a cultural referendum. Here's the paradox that defines The Deputy today. The Vatican eventually opened its wartime archives in 2020, ostensibly to settle the debate once and for all. Yet the documents only deepened the ambiguity, revealing a pope who privately aided some Jews while publicly maintaining neutrality. Hochhuth's play, for all its blunt force, had anticipated this gray zone. Its power lay not in proving malice, but in exposing how institutions prioritize self-preservation over moral clarity. When a Swiss critic wrote that the play made history a collaborator, he grasped its true innovation. By dragging the past onto the stage, Hochhuth proved that sometimes the most subversive act isn't rewriting history, it's refusing to let it off the hook. The legacy of The Deputy lingers in every documentary drama that dares to name living culprits or challenge state-sanctioned amnesia. From the Laramie Project to Stuff Happens, its DNA is everywhere. Because the play's ultimate revelation wasn't about one pope's choices, it was about art's ability to turn collective guilt into collective responsibility. And that's a lesson no amount of censorship can unteach. When the curtain falls on uncomfortable truths, the real performance is just beginning. There's a moment in Peter Weiss's The Persecution and Assassination of Jean-Paul Marat, as performed by the inmates of the Asylum of Charenton under the direction of the Marquis de Sade, where the fourth wall doesn't just break, it evaporates. The audience, expecting to watch a safe historical drama about the French Revolution, suddenly finds itself implicated. actors playing asylum inmates shove pamphlets into their hands, demand answers to rhetorical questions, and at one point, an actor might even spit in their direction. This wasn't theater as escapism, it was theater as confrontation, premiering in 1965 at the height of global upheavals from Vietnam to the civil rights movement. Weiss's play didn't just depict revolution, it dared to simulate one in real time. What made Marat/Sade so radioactive to dictatorships wasn't its script, though its portrayal of institutional corruption certainly stung. It was the way it weaponized the act of watching. Traditional censorship relies on a simple premise. That art is a one-way street with power controlling the message. But Weiss flipped the dynamic by forcing audiences to participate, whether through shouted responses, uncomfortable eye contact, or the creeping realization that they, too, were playing a role. The play erased the safe distance between spectator and actor. In apartheid South Africa, where the regime relied on enforced silence, this was existential. A play that trained people to speak back, even in metaphor, was a threat no amount of police batons could contain. Brazil's military junta understood the danger even faster. When a São Paulo production in 1968 began attracting students and union activists, the generals didn't just ban the play, they raided theaters mid-performance, dragging actors offstage in costume. Their fear wasn't irrational. Marat/Sade didn't need explicit calls to action. Its form was the rebellion. The moment an audience member laughed at the asylum's cruel director or flinched when inmates reenacted the September massacres, they'd already crossed a line. They'd stopped consuming and started judging, and that shift from passive absorption to active critique is what every authoritarian system fears most. Weiss's genius lay in his double mirror. The play within a play structure meant audiences weren't just watching revolutionaries. They were watching inmates play revolutionaries under the watchful eye of the Marquis de Sade, their jailer. Layers of irony piled up. Was this a condemnation of violence or a celebration? A warning or a provocation? The ambiguity was deliberate. By refusing to moralize, Weiss forced viewers to locate their own complicity. When the inmate playing Marat screams, "The revolution is like a mirror, it shows you who you really are," the line ricocheted beyond the stage. Apartheid cops saw Marxists, Brazilian students saw martyrs, and the censors, tellingly, saw themselves reflected in Sade's smug manipulations. The bans backfired spectacularly. In Johannesburg, underground readings spread through townships, with audiences taking turns voicing different inmates. In Rio, activists printed excerpts on flyers disguised as grocery lists. The play's real triumph wasn't surviving suppression, it was proving that participatory art can't be contained. Because once people experience collective catharsis, even in fiction, they start recognizing its absence in reality. That's why Marat/Sade still unnerves governments today. Not because it incites riots, but because it teaches something far more dangerous: how to be an audience that refuses to applaud on command. Venice in 1749 was a city of masks, not just the glittering disguises of carnival, but the elaborate charade of an empire built on invisible labor. Enter Carlo Goldoni's Slave Island, a comedy that should have been harmless. Bumbling Venetian merchants shipwrecked on an island, outwitted by the very people they meant to enslave. But the punchlines landed like cannon fire. When the enslaved characters turned the tables, revealing sharper wit and deeper humanity than their would-be captors, something unexpected happened. The audience cheered. And that's when the censors panicked. Goldoni's crime wasn't mocking slavery, it was making it ridiculous. By stripping away the veneer of racial superiority, he exposed the absurdity at slavery's core, the idea that one person could own another. In one scene, a merchant insists slaves are naturally lazy, only for an islander to retort, "Then why do you need chains to keep us from working?" The laughter that followed carried an edge. Because while Europe's elites debated abolition in hushed salons, Slave Island smuggled the argument into cheap seats where dockworkers and fishmongers could grasp its truth instantly. What makes this ban so revealing is who issued it, not some distant colonial power, but Venice's own ruling council, the same men who'd grown rich off the Adriatic slave trade. Their fear wasn't of revolt but recognition. The play's real danger lay in its empathy. By giving enslaved characters agency, humor, and even moral high ground, Goldoni forced audiences to see them as people. And once that line is crossed, chains become harder to justify. Yet the suppression backfired spectacularly. Copies circulated underground, translated into dialects censors couldn't track. French philosophers cited it in abolitionist tracts, and within decades, Venetian theaters were staging watered-down versions, proof that ideas once set loose can't be unthought. Slave Island didn't just entertain, it demonstrated satire's power to corrode injustice, not with solemnity, but with the most dangerous weapon of all, laughter that makes the powerful squirm. Because when a system depends on people not asking questions, the simplest punchline can become revolutionary. The Cataract of the Ganges wasn't meant to be revolutionary. On the surface, it was pure spectacle, a lavish British melodrama complete with crashing waterfalls, daring rescues, and a star-crossed romance. But when the curtain rose in Calcutta in 1823, colonial authorities saw something far more dangerous, a story where Indian rebels weren't faceless villains, but sympathetic figures fighting for their homeland. The East India Company's censors reacted with disproportionate fury, banning the play not for its quality, but for its unthinkable crime, humanizing the very people Britain was trying to rule. What made this ban so revealing was its hypocrisy. British theatregoers back in London adored the play as harmless exoticism, cheering the heroics of their colonial stand-ins. But when those same lines were spoken on Indian soil, they took on a dangerous electricity, a scene where a rebel leader declared, "The land you tread is ours by right," might earn applause in Drury Lane, but in Calcutta it became a rallying cry. The company wasn't just afraid of rebellion, they feared the power of recognition, that moment when an audience sees their own struggles reflected on stage and realizes they're not alone. The censor's dilemma was exquisite in its irony. By shutting down performances, they amplified the play's message, turning it into whispered legend. Yet allowing it to continue risked something worse, normalization. Every night the play ran was another night Indians could watch British actors, however unintentionally, validate resistance. The company's panic exposed a truth they'd rather ignore. Empire wasn't just maintained by soldiers and taxes, but by controlling the stories people told about themselves. And in that theater, the narrative was slipping from their grasp. This wasn't just about one play. The Cataract of the Ganges became a blueprint for how anti-colonial movements would weaponize culture. Future revolutionaries from Ireland to Indonesia would stage band plays in back rooms, knowing that censorship couldn't unmake the ideas they planted. Because when a colonizer's own art accidentally arms the colonized, it proves a terrifying truth: no story is ever truly under control. The waterfall on stage might have been painted canvas, but the flood it foreshadowed was all too real. It should have been a triumph of New Deal idealism, a government-funded musical celebrating the very workers whose votes put Roosevelt in office. But when Mark Blitzstein's The Cradle Will Rock premiered in 1937, the Works Progress Administration didn't just cancel the show. They locked the theater doors, chained the sets in storage, and forbade the cast from performing on any stage. the irony was thicker than stage paint. A play about union solidarity, produced by a New Deal program, was being strangled by the same bureaucracy that claimed to champion the little guy. Because here's the dirty secret no one wanted exposed: when art bites the hand that feeds, even democracies flinch. Blitzstein's crime wasn't vulgarity or treason. It was naming names. His musical didn't just champion steelworkers, it skewered the industrialists who crushed them. When the character Mr. a thinly veiled stand-in for real-life steel barons, sang, "The law is 10% justice and 90% manipulation," the laughter in the cheap seats carried a dangerous edge. Because this wasn't Soviet propaganda, it was American reality set to catchy tunes, and that's when the pressure came down, not from Congress or the courts, but from the WPA's own higher-ups, suddenly nervous about offending the very tycoons whose factories Roosevelt needed to revive the economy. The response from the cast and crew became theatrical legend. Barred from their own stage, they marched to a vacant theater down the street. With no sets, no costumes, and no orchestra, the musicians' union had been strong-armed into refusing participation. Blitzstein sat at a lone piano onstage while the cast performed from the audience, rising to deliver lines like a chorus of ghosts. The effect was electric. Stripped of spectacle, the words themselves became the revolution. When the actress playing Moll, a prostitute-turned-union organizer, declared, "You can't chain a voice," the crowd erupted. Because in that moment, the play's message and its real-life suppression had merged into something unstoppable. What makes this censorship saga so uniquely American is its layers of hypocrisy. The WPA, created to uplift the arts, became the censor. The unions meant to protect workers were weaponized against them, and the government, which praised free speech in theory, panicked when art turned that speech into a mirror. Yet the crackdown backfired spectacularly. Newsreels captured the defiant performance, turning a niche musical into a national conversation about who really controls culture. By the time The Cradle Will Rock finally reached Broadway years later, stripped of WPA funding, its reputation as a David vs. Goliath tale had already cemented its place in history. The play's real legacy isn't just its critique of capitalism, it's the blueprint it offered for resisting censorship with creativity. When authorities take away the stage, you turn the sidewalk into a theater. When they silence the orchestra, a single piano becomes a rebellion, because the most dangerous art isn't what's funded, it's what refuses to disappear. And sometimes all it takes is an empty space and a crowd willing to listen. There's a moment in Angels in America where Prior Walter, a young man ravaged by AIDS, looks into the audience and says, "We won't die secret deaths anymore." That line wasn't just dialogue, it was a declaration of war against silence. When Tony Kushner's 7-hour masterpiece debuted in the early 1990s, the AIDS epidemic had already claimed thousands of lives, many of them gay men abandoned by their government. The play didn't just document the crisis, it weaponized theater as an act of witness, and that's exactly why school boards in South Carolina and councils in London fought to keep it off stages. They weren't afraid of the sex or the swearing, they were terrified of the play's relentless humanity. What made Angels in America so threatening wasn't its critique of Reagan-era indifference, though that stung. It was the way Kushner forced audiences to sit with the dying, to laugh with them, rage with them, and finally mourn them. In one harrowing scene, Prior hallucinates an angel who calls him a prophet. The moment could have been absurd, but Kushner grounded it in raw vulnerability. When Prior whispers, "I just want to stay alive," the politics fell away. This wasn't a statistic or a stereotype, it was a person. And that intimacy shattered the comfortable distance audiences might have preferred. Censors could dismiss activists as troublemakers, but how do you dismiss a character who crawls into your heart and stays there? The backlash was swift and revealing. A North Carolina school board banned a student production, calling it obscene, while British MPs pressured the National Theatre to cancel performances. But the most telling resistance came from quieter corners, the donors who threatened to pull funding, the reviewers who called it hysterical, the audiences who walked out during the love scenes. Their discomfort wasn't about morality, it was about recognition. Angels refused to let anyone look away from the consequences of bigotry and neglect. When Roy Cohn, the play's venomous McCarthyite lawyer, dies of AIDS while denying his own homosexuality, the tragedy isn't just his hypocrisy, it's the system that made lying a survival tactic. Yet the play's real victory lay in its defiance of erasure. Every attempt to ban it, whether through budget cuts or bogus decency claims, only amplified its urgency. Underground readings sprouted in community centers, and high schoolers smuggled dog-eared scripts to friends. By the time HBO adapted it in 2003, the culture had shifted, in part because Kushner's words had carved a path. The play didn't just survive censorship, it exposed the cowardice behind it, because when authorities try to silence a story about people fighting to be seen, they're not protecting audiences, they're admitting how powerful it is to be seen. The legacy of angels in America echoes in every pride parade, every AIDS quilt, every time someone says silence equals death. Kushner proved that empathy isn't passive, it's the first domino in social change. And that's why the play still terrifies those in power, not because it's radical, but because it's right. When Pryor turns to the audience and says, "The world only spins forward," he's not just comforting himself, he's warning every censor who thinks they can stop the tide by closing a curtain. History, like theater, has a way of making even the most determined silencers into bit players in a much larger story. Sometimes a play doesn't even need to open to ignite a firestorm. My name is Rachel Corrie, a one-woman show pieced together from the diaries and emails of a 23-year-old American activist crushed by an Israeli bulldozer in Gaza, wasn't banned by any government. Instead, it vanished from a New York stage in 2006 before a single performance, shelved by a theater company terrified of backlash, the official reason. Sensitivity to the community, but the real message was louder. Some stories are too dangerous to be heard, even in the heart of Manhattan. What made this cancellation so insidious was its mechanism. No armed police stormed the theater, no official decree labeled the play seditious. The New York Theater Workshop folded under pressure from pro-Israel donors and advocacy groups, enacting what scholars now call soft censorship, the quiet suffocation of art through financial intimidation and reputational risk. Unlike Stalinist purges or Victorian vice squads, this censorship wore a suit and spoke in boardroom euphemisms. Not the right time, too polarizing, let's revisit next season. The play wasn't erased, it was disappeared through sheer bureaucratic inertia, and that's the modern threat to dissent. When corporations and nonprofits replace dictators as gatekeepers, the silencing feels voluntary, even polite. Rachel Corrie's writings weren't radical manifestos. They were the raw, unfiltered observations of an idealistic young woman volunteering in Rafah, watching homes demolished, children playing in rubble, the daily surrealism of occupation. The play's power lay in its intimacy, a single actress on a bare stage channeling lines like, "I'm scared for these people. What would you do if you saw a child shot in front of you?" This wasn't geopolitical analysis, it was a scream of witness, and that's precisely what frightened the establishment. Governments can dispute facts, but how do you refute a diary entry? The aftermath revealed the double standard at play. While theaters across Europe and the Middle East staged Rachel Corrie to acclaim, American producers scrambled to avoid it like radioactive material. Even venues known for edgy work suddenly developed cold feet, whispering about balance, as if human rights required a both sides disclaimer. The irony. By trying to avoid controversy, the theater amplified it. News of the cancellation spread faster than any marketing campaign could have, turning an obscure play into a referendum on free speech. Underground readings sprouted in churches and college campuses, each one a quiet rebellion against the idea that some lives are too politicized to mourn. Here's the uncomfortable truth this episode exposed. In liberal democracies, censorship rarely arrives with a hammer. It comes as a spreadsheet, a calculation of donor reactions, subscriber losses, and Twitter storms. The real danger isn't that art gets banned, but that it never gets staged in the first place, because the risk assessment killed it in rehearsal. My Name is Rachel Corrie became a ghost haunting American theater, proof that the market doesn't just entertain, it polices. And the most chilling part, we'll never know how many other plays have been quietly strangled in their cribs, casualties of a system where the curtain falls before the lights even go up. Yet the story doesn't end there. A year later, the play finally opened off-Broadway to sold-out crowds, its delay only sharpening its urgency. That's the paradox of soft censorship. It plants the very seeds it tries to uproot. Because when you tell people a story is too dangerous to hear, they'll move heaven and earth to listen. And in that act of defiance, the real drama unfolds not on stage, but in the audience as they decide who gets to control which voices matter. The Exonerated didn't just tell stories, it forced audiences to stare into the eyes of living ghosts. This groundbreaking docudrama, crafted from real letters, court transcripts, and interviews with 6 wrongfully convicted death row survivors, turned abstract debates about justice into something visceral. When Sunny Jacobs, a woman who spent 16 years in prison for a crime she didn't commit, described watching her husband executed before her eyes, the effect wasn't just heartbreaking, it was paralyzing. And that's exactly what terrified certain state governments, because while they could dismiss activists' arguments as political grandstanding, they couldn't refute the trembling hands of jurors who, after seeing the play, hesitated to vote for execution in real trials. What made this censorship so unusual was its transparency. Authorities didn't claim the play was factually flawed or legally inaccurate. They openly admitted their fear. Art was changing minds in ways statistics never could. In Oklahoma, where one exonerate's case had originated, prison officials abruptly canceled a scheduled performance for inmates, citing emotional agitation risks. In Texas, prosecutors lobbied to keep the play out of university theaters, arguing it could taint jury pools. The irony was staggering. The same system that relied on dramatic courtroom narratives to secure convictions now feared drama that exposed its flaws. The play's power lay in its simplicity. No elaborate sets, no actors weeping on cue, just bare-bone testimonies delivered straight to the audience. When Delbert Tibbs, a poet and former death row inmate, spoke his real words, "They stole my life, then offered me money like it was a rental fee," the silence in the theater wasn't just absence of sound. It was the sound of cognitive dissonance cracking. Audiences weren't being lectured about systemic racism or prosecutorial misconduct. They were hearing it in the cadence of a man who'd lived it. And that intimacy bypassed political filters, striking straight at the human instinct for empathy. Critics of the play missed the point entirely. This wasn't anti-death penalty propaganda, it was a spotlight on fallibility. By showcasing how eyewitness misidentification, coerced confessions, and overworked public defenders could converge into catastrophic error, the exonerated asked a question no justice system wants to entertain. If innocence doesn't always protect you, how can guilt justify killing? The answer unsettled even supporters of capital punishment. After performances in North Carolina, local newspapers reported jurors requesting exemptions from death penalty cases. In Florida, a state legislator who'd championed execution laws publicly reversed his stance, crediting the play. The backlash revealed an uncomfortable truth about censorship in democratic societies. It's rarely about hiding facts, it's about controlling how those facts are felt. When authorities suppress art not for lying, but for making truth too palpable, they admit something profound, that the real threat isn't misinformation, but emotional resonance. The exonerated didn't need to exaggerate to shock. Reality was horrifying enough, and that's why its legacy endures. Because when a government fears theater more than protest marches, it's not just admitting art's power, it's confessing the system's fragility. Every cancelled performance, every nervous prosecutor's memo, became an unintended encore to the play's central thesis. That justice, when performed without room for doubt, can become its own kind of crime. Shakespeare never could have imagined a world where his plays trended on Twitter, but in 2017, that's exactly where Julius Caesar landed. The Public Theatre's Central Park production should have been just another summer Shakespeare staple. But this time, the titular emperor strutted across the stage in a gold tie, with slicked-back blonde hair and a wife whose accent sounded suspiciously Slovenian. The parallels to a certain 45th president weren't just implied, they were unavoidable, and that's when Fox News exploded. Headlines screamed, "Trump assassination play." Sponsors like Delta Airlines pulled funding, and suddenly, a 400-year-old tragedy became the battleground for modern free speech. The irony, this wasn't even the first politically charged Caesar. During the 1930s, Orson Welles staged a fascist-style production that critics hailed as a bold anti-Hitler statement. Same script, different villain, proof that censorship isn't about the words on the page, but who's listening to them. What made this controversy so revealing was its shifting frontline. No government censors stormed the theater. Instead, outrage flowed through cable news chyrons and corporate boardrooms. When Bank of America and Delta withdrew support, they didn't cite legal violations. They cited inflammatory content, a vague term that essentially meant, "This makes our shareholders nervous." Here's the twist: the play's director had deliberately avoided glorifying Caesar's murder. The production framed the assassination as a chaotic, morally ambiguous act, with Brutus's remorse taking center stage. But nuance doesn't trend. Fox Clips cherry-picked the bloody climax, stripping away context to paint it as a literal call for violence. The result, a masterclass in how modern censorship operates, not through state bans, but through the quiet pressure of capital and the amplification of selective outrage. The backlash exposed a peculiar hypocrisy. Conservatives who'd spent decades defending Shakespeare as high culture now labeled him violent leftist propaganda, while liberals who championed artistic freedom found themselves parsing whether the staging went too far. Lost in the noise was the play's actual warning that political violence, once unleashed, spirals beyond anyone's control. The Public Theatre's Caesar didn't just resemble Trump, he mirrored every demagogue audiences feared in their own era. That's why the play survives. Its power lies not in endorsing assassination, but in forcing viewers to confront the seductive chaos of power vacuums. When Brutus whispers, "The abuse of greatness is when it disjoins remorse from power," the line isn't partisan, it's prophetic. Yet the real lesson of 2017 wasn't about Shakespeare. It was about who gets to control the narrative in a hyper-connected age. When media ecosystems can weaponize art by framing it as dangerous, and corporations can defund productions without explanation. Censorship wears a new mask. No one needs to burn books when algorithms can shadow ban them, or when sponsors can vanish at the first whiff of controversy. The Julius Caesar debacle proved that the battleground for free expression has shifted, from royal decrees to viral hashtags, from state censors to boardroom Zoom calls. And perhaps that's the most unsettling parallel of all. Just as Caesar's Rome had its mobs and mercenaries, our modern colosseums have their own arbiters of outrage, armed not with daggers, but with ad revenue and impact reports. The play may be ancient, but its newest performance revealed a timeless truth. When art holds up a mirror, someone will always try to smash the glass. The moment the lights dimmed on Paradise Now, audiences knew they weren't watching another geopolitical drama. They were stepping into a moral minefield. This Palestinian play didn't just depict a suicide bomber's final hours. It crawled inside his skin, tracing the fragile line between martyrdom and murder with unsettling intimacy. When the protagonist whispers, "I don't want to die, I want to live so loudly that death hears me," the discomfort in the theater was palpable. Because here's the unspoken rule Paradise Now shattered: violence is only acceptable on stage when its perpetrators are monsters, not men. France's ban in 2005 wasn't about public safety, it was about narrative control. Officials claimed the play glorified terrorism, but its real crime was far subtler. By showing the bomber as a product of occupation, heartbreak, and yes, even humor, it forced Western audiences to sit with an unbearable question: what if the face of evil looks like someone's son? The backlash wasn't confined to legislatures. Protests erupted from Brussels to Broadway, with protesters many who'd never seen the play brandishing signs that read, "Art shouldn't humanize horror." The irony, these critics missed the play's central paradox. It wasn't justifying violence, it was exposing how dehumanization fuels its cycle. When you reduce any human to a caricature, you don't prevent extremism, you feed its roots. The controversy revealed a hypocrisy baked into free speech debates. We celebrate art that challenges power, unless it challenges our power. Plays vilifying dictators or colonial regimes win Tonys and standing ovations, but let a script hint that occupation might birth desperation, and suddenly artistic license has limits. Paradise Now didn't ask for sympathy, it demanded acknowledgement. In one haunting scene, the bomber's childhood friend, now a peace activist, pleads with him, "You're not a statistic, don't let them turn you into one." The line cuts deeper when you realize this same plea could have been directed at the play's detractors. What makes this censorship so haunting isn't its rarity, but its familiarity. From the deputy to Rachel Corrie, the pattern repeats. Stories that complicate the hero-villain binary get labeled dangerous, while those reinforcing it earn accolades. Paradise Now didn't just blur moral lines, it forced audiences to question why we draw them where we do. When French authorities banned the play, they didn't protect anyone from radicalization. They proved how desperately we cling to simplicity. Because if extremism has a human face, then so might our complicity. The play's ultimate rebellion wasn't its content, but its aftermath. Banned in France, it became a clandestine sensation, performed in warehouses and living rooms where whispers carried farther than spotlights ever could. Every suppressed script, every hissed warning, only cemented its thesis. That fear of understanding is more volatile than any explosive. And perhaps that's the most terrifying truth of all. When we silence stories that unsettle us, we don't diffuse their power. We become characters in the very narrative we tried to erase. There's a reason dictators fear laughter, but they tremble at the sound of women naming their own bodies. When Eve Enslurs the Vagina monologues premiered in 1998, it wasn't just a play. It was an act of reclamation. Night after night, women stood on stage and said words like clitoris and vagina aloud, not in medical terms or whispered shame, but with joy, rage, and sometimes tears. In one unforgettable moment, an actress moaned theatrically for 10 straight minutes, turning a simulated orgasm into both comedy and catharsis. The audience howled not just at the humor, but at the sheer audacity of women occupying space without apology. And that's when the backlash began. The bands came dressed in bureaucratic euphemisms. At Boston College, administrators canceled a student production citing graphic content, as if the female body were inherently obscene. In Uganda, authorities outlawed the play entirely, calling it a tool of homosexuality. But the real subtext was unmistakable: control. Because when women name their experiences, from pleasure to assault, they shatter the silence that sustains oppression. One particularly telling scene features a Bosnian refugee describing wartime rape. The monologue isn't explicit. Its power lies in its quiet specificity. When she says, "They took turns for 7 days, my vagina became a river of tears," the horror isn't in the details, it's in the act of testimony itself. Because regimes that weaponize sexuality know something vital, stories are the first step toward justice. What made the vagina monologues uniquely threatening wasn't its content, it was its collectivity. This wasn't one woman whispering in a therapist's office. It was thousands performing in unison from New York to Nairobi. When college students in Texas were banned from saying vagina on stage, they staged a read-in on the campus lawn, megaphones blaring the forbidden word. In Lahore, underground performances were held in private homes, women passing dog-eared scripts like contraband. The play's global journey mirrored feminism's toughest battles, banned in places where patriarchal control was brittle, celebrated where resistance had taken root. The most revealing censorship attempts weren't the outright bans, they were the compromises. At one Southern university, administrators allowed the play only if students omitted the lesbian monologue. Another demanded the word vagina be replaced with private part. These edits exposed the true anxiety, not about vulgarity, but about women defining their own narratives. Because once a woman says, "This is my body and I will speak of it," she's already begun the work of dismantling empires. Ensler's masterpiece proved that censorship is never about morality, it's about power. When authorities in Romania banned the play for undermining family values, they accidentally endorsed its central thesis, that patriarchy depends on women's silence. Yet every suppression backfired. College bans turned sleepy campuses into protests, and international crackdowns made the script a feminist samizdat. Even the act of redacting certain lines became its own performance, with audiences hissing at each omission like a Greek chorus. The play's ultimate triumph wasn't just surviving censorship, it was weaponizing it. Because when you try to silence women, you don't erase their voices, you amplify them, and sometimes all it takes is one defiant whisper in the dark to start an avalanche. Dr. Stockman never set out to be a villain, he just wanted clean water. In Henrik Ibsen's An Enemy of the People, this small-town physician makes a horrifying discovery. The baths that fuel his community's economy are secretly poisoned. His crime wasn't uncovering the truth, it was refusing to let it stay buried. When he warns his neighbors, the backlash isn't just indifference, it's outright fury. The mayor, his own brother, spins the facts to protect tourism. The newspaper backtracks under advertiser pressure. And by the play's climax, the doctor stands alone in a shuttered meeting hall, pelted with stones as the crowd chants, "Traitor." What makes this moment so chilling isn't its 19th century setting. it's how often it's been replayed in modern boardrooms and city halls from Flint, Michigan to Fukushima. Ibsen's play struck a nerve industrialists couldn't ignore. Factories in Manchester banned performances after workers started demanding safer conditions, recognizing the parallels between poisoned baths and toxic smokestacks. Russian censors under the Tsar suppressed it for inciting unrest, while American steel towns quietly pressured theaters to drop productions. Their fear wasn't unfounded. When truth becomes inconvenient, an enemy of the people demonstrates how swiftly societies pivot from denial to retaliation. The play's genius lies in its structure. It's not a hero's journey, but a slow-motion car crash. Every institution that should protect Stockman, the press, local government, even his friends, twists itself into knots to silence him. The real poison isn't in the water. It's in the system's willingness to drink it rather than admit fault. Modern revivals have turned Ibsen's warning into a grim barometer of crisis. After Flint's water scandal erupted in 2014, theater companies across Michigan staged readings where actors swapped Norwegian names for local officials. In Japan, post-Fukushima productions framed Stockman as a nuclear engineer. His warnings about radiation met with the same bureaucratic stonewalling. The play's adaptability reveals its central truth. The mechanisms of suppression haven't evolved, only their disguises. Where once mayors invoked civic pride to hush dissent, now corporations deploy confidentiality agreements and damage control. The script remains eerily unchanged because human nature refuses to rewrite itself. What censors feared most wasn't the play's critique of corruption, but its prophecy about timing. An enemy of the people doesn't end with the town's redemption. The baths stay open, the doctor is ruined, and the curtain falls on a community choosing willful blindness. Ibsen's real transgression was showing how rarely truth wins in the moment, and how art can outlast the lies meant to bury it. Decades later, when those same industrial towns faced lawsuits from cancer clusters and birth defects, the play resurfaced like a ghost. Not as fiction, but as evidence, because the ultimate power of banned theater isn't in changing minds today, it's in ensuring that when the reckoning comes, no one can claim they weren't warned. The play's title has become a self-fulfilling prophecy. From climate scientists to whistleblowers, those labeled enemies of the people often share Stockman's fate, vilified before they're vindicated. Yet Ibsen's darkest insight isn't about persecution, it's about complicity. The townspeople aren't evil, they're terrified. Terrified of lost jobs, of upheaval, of admitting they've been duped. That's why this 19th century drama still draws gasps in 21st century audiences. Not because it shocks, but because it forces us to ask, whose stones would we throw, and how long before we're the ones drinking the poison? Arthur Miller didn't just write a play about 17th century witch trials. He held up a funhouse mirror to 20th century America, and the reflection was too damning to ignore. The Crucible arrived in 1953 like a lit match tossed into the dry tinder of McCarthyism. On the surface, it was a historical drama about Puritan hysteria, where whispers of witchcraft tore apart a community. But every line thrummed with subtext. When Abigail Williams cried, "I saw Goody Proctor with the devil," audiences heard the ghostly echo of Senator McCarthy's famous question, "Are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?" The parallels weren't subtle, they were the point, and that's precisely why U.S. embassies from Brussels to Buenos Aires quietly blacklisted productions, terrified that foreign audiences might see American justice as just another Salem courthouse. The irony was thicker than the fog over Massachusetts. By banning The Crucible abroad, the State Department didn't disprove Miller's Allegory, they acted it out. Just as Salem's judges conflated dissent with devilry, McCarthy's enforcers treated any critique of red baiting as evidence of red sympathies. Miller himself was hauled before the House Un-American Activities Committee the year after the play's premiere, where he refused to name names, later calling the experience Salem with microphones. The government's panic revealed their darkest fear, that art could reframe history in real time, turning congressional hearings into modern-day witch trials before the world's eyes. What made The Crucible uniquely dangerous wasn't its critique of McCarthyism, it was its timelessness. Unlike pamphlets or speeches tied to a specific moment, Miller's Allegory proved endlessly adaptable. When apartheid South Africa banned it in the 1960s, audiences recognized the specter of their own past laws in the play's midnight arrests. In 21st century China, student productions drew unsubtle parallels between spectral evidence and internet surveillance. The play became a shape-shifter, morphing to expose whatever system traded truth for conformity. Even the act of censorship fed its power because every time a regime suppressed the crucible, they resurrected its central question: what are you so afraid we'll see? Miller's masterstroke was in showing how hysteria corrupts language itself. Salem's trials twisted words until innocent meant cunning and silence meant guilt. Sound familiar? In the 1950s, patriot became code for informant, loyalty a weapon to bludgeon dissent. The play's most quoted line, "We burn a hot fire here, it melts down all concealment," wasn't just Puritan zeal. It was the chilling logic of every inquisition, from the Red Scare to the War on Terror. When authorities in Berlin banned a 1954 production for anti-Americanism, they missed the tragedy. The play wasn't attacking America. It was pleading with it to remember itself, yet the Crucible's greatest rebellion was its refusal to offer easy heroes. John Proctor isn't a flawless martyr. He's an adulterer who hesitates, lies, and almost signs a false confession to save his skin. His final act of tearing up the confession isn't triumphant, it's desperate. That complexity made the play impossible to dismiss as mere propaganda. Because real witch hunts don't end when noble resistors stand tall, they end when enough people, flawed and frightened, finally say, enough. The play's endurance lies in its uncomfortable truth, that societies don't collapse because of a few bad actors, but because of countless ordinary people who look away just a little too long. 70 years later, the play's bans have become relics, but its warnings feel freshly urgent. When TikTok teens in 2023 staged viral Crucible clips to critique cancel culture, they proved Miller's Allegory still breathes. Because whether the mob cries witch or fascist or woke, the machinery of hysteria remains the same. The play's real magic isn't in its historical accuracy, it's in its eerie precision at diagnosing the moment before the fever breaks. And that's why, long after the last McCarthy hearing faded into history, the Crucible still holds court, not as a period piece, but as a mirror, one that every generation must dare to look into, no matter how stark the reflection. There's something uniquely destabilizing about nostalgia in the wrong hands, or rather, the hands a government can't control. Shen Yun isn't just a dance performance, it's a time machine wrapped in silk and propaganda. Since 2006, this Falun Gong-affiliated spectacle has crisscrossed Western stages with a paradoxical mission: to resurrect traditional Chinese culture while condemning the regime that claims to protect it. The choreography dazzles water sleeves fluttering like ink brushstrokes, warriors leaping to the thunder of ancient drums, but beneath the artistry lies a grenade. Each ballet and ballad whispers a dangerous idea, that communist China isn't the guardian of 5,000 years of history, but its eraser. And that's why, despite its global tours, Shen Yun hasn't touched a single stage in mainland China. The ban isn't about politics, it's about who gets to own memory itself. What makes this cultural war so potent is its disguise. Unlike pamphlets or protests, Shen Yun weaponizes beauty. A folk dance about lotus pickers becomes an elegy for pre-revolutionary simplicity. A scene from Journey to the West morphs into Allegory, with the Monkey King's rebellion against heaven mirroring Falun Gong's defiance. The production's genius lies in its dual audience. For Western viewers, it's a vibrant introduction to Chinese tradition. For diaspora communities, it's a rallying cry, a reminder of the stories their relatives once told before censors rewrote them. And that's the CCP's nightmare. They can crush dissent in Tiananmen Square, but how do you arrest a melody? How do you redact a pirouette? The Chinese government's response reveals their deeper anxiety. State media doesn't just dismiss Shen Yun. It feverishly produces copycat state-approved spectacles like The East is Red or The Road to Revival that repackage the same dances and legends with Communist Party slogans. It's a desperate pantomime, like watching two actors duel over the same costume, because authoritarianism isn't just threatened by opposition, it's haunted by alternatives. Every Shen Yun performance in Sydney or New York proves that the party's version of history isn't the only one. When the show's finale features a celestial chorus singing, truthfulness, compassion, forbearance, Falun Gong's mantra, it's not just a religious message. It's a taunt. You can ban our words, but can you unhear a song? Yet the real battleground isn't in theaters, it's in living rooms. For older Chinese immigrants, Shen Yun triggers memories of childhood folktales and festivals erased by the Cultural Revolution. For their Western-born children, it's a puzzle. Why does mom cry during a dance about peonies? The show's power grows in these generational gaps, where nostalgia becomes a bridge to politics. When the CCP blocks VPN access to Shen Yun trailers, they're not just censoring art, they're trying to sever a lifeline between past and present. Because once people start questioning which traditions are authentic, they might start asking who decided and what else was left out. The irony, Shen Yun's global success depends entirely on its banishment. If China allowed the show, its subversive glamour would fade. Like samizdat literature under the Soviets, the performance draws oxygen from its own suppression. Every time an official warns citizens abroad not to attend, every time a Weibo post about it vanishes, the legend grows, because censorship doesn't kill forbidden art, it turns it into a ghost. And ghosts, as any Chinese folklorist knows, are the hardest stories to silence. Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton should have been the ultimate bipartisan success, a hip-hop musical celebrating America's founding, embraced by Obama and even grudgingly praised by conservatives for its patriotic flair. But in 2018, a Puerto Rican school made headlines when it canceled a student production, citing the musical's problematic portrayal of immigrants and slaveholders. The irony was almost too perfect. A show about who gets to control history became a battleground over who gets to control art. This wasn't censorship by a monarchy or a dictatorship. It was a new kind of silencing, where the left and right both became gatekeepers of what stories deserve a stage. What made this controversy so disorienting was its reversal of traditional fault lines. Conservatives, who'd spent decades railing against profanity and sexuality in art, suddenly championed Hamilton as a triumph of American values. Meanwhile, progressives who'd fought book bans now questioned whether a mostly non-white cast could justify glorifying slave-owning founders. The debate exposed an uncomfortable truth. Censorship isn't about ideology, it's about control. Whether it's a Florida school board removing LGBTQ+ books or a liberal college canceling Hamilton, the mechanism is the same. Someone decides a story is too dangerous to be heard, and the curtain falls before the audience can judge for themselves. The musical's central question, who lives, who dies, who tells your story, became its own trap. By framing history as a narrative battle, Hamilton accidentally proved how easily that battle can turn inward. Activists argued the musical whitewashes oppression by making rap battles out of slaveholders' lives, while traditionalists claimed revising historical figures through modern lenses was itself a form of erasure. Both sides missed Miranda's point. History isn't a monument, it's a conversation. The moment we stop retelling it, we freeze it into dogma. But try explaining that to a generation raised on social media, where every artistic choice is either a rallying cry or a war crime. The real tragedy of the Puerto Rican cancellation wasn't the silenced students, it was the lost opportunity. Hamilton's magic lies in its contradictions. It lets Thomas Jefferson twirl across stage in purple velvet while owning humans, and has Angelica Schuyler rap about feminism in a corset. The dissonance isn't an accident, it's the whole point. History is messy, and so is art, but in an age of purity tests, nuance reads as betrayal. The school's decision didn't protect anyone. It robbed kids of the chance to grapple with complexity, to ask why we can love a nation's ideals while loathing its sins. Yet buried in this mess is a twisted hope. The fact that Hamilton triggered such fierce debates proves its power. When art becomes dangerous enough to cancel from all sides, it's usually because it's working. The Founding Fathers knew this better than anyone. They built a nation on free expression, then immediately started jailing journalists. Maybe that's the musical's ultimate lesson. The fight over who controls stories isn't a bug in the system. It's the system, and if we're still yelling about it 200 years later, well, that's the sound of democracy hitting its high note.